Hello everyone, and welcome back to our Chapter 18 lecture mini-series here. We are moving on to lecture number 2 here, and as you can see, lecture number 2 is focused on the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, so we're really getting into the master gland. If you remember from lecture 1, I kind of overviewed some of the endocrine organs, and of course the hypothalamus being the master gland and the pituitary gland being the vice president. Those were kind of the standards we set, but we're going to really expand on them. So if that didn't really make sense in the previous lecture, don't worry too much about it. We're going to really clarify these two, but as you can see, 2 glands are going to take up one entire lecture. So quite intense, quite a bit of materials. If you just look at this, you can see there's a lot of hormones to get through on the pituitary side, but you can see the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are really, really close together. And if you forgot that this is actually part of the brain, right, the optic chiasm, you have the hypothalamus sitting above, connected to the pituitary gland below. So that's what we're going to be exploring in these in this entire second lecture here. And if you're keeping track, and hopefully you're starting to make sense of how I phrase things, I know this is really early, this would be the 3rd episode total. I did Chapter 18 Lecture 1, Part 1, and Part 2 so far. So this is Chapter 18 Lecture 2, Parts 1, 2, and 3. We're going to cover Part 1 right here. Like I said, I try to keep my lectures right around 20 to 30 minutes, and so that's why I kind of break these into parts, where usually that'll take about an hour, hour and 20 minutes in a normal classroom setup. As you can see, here are your objectives. If you really want to break these down, you can pause this and read over them to kind of know what's going on in this entire lecture series, but Part 1 just focuses really on these top 3. So pause it if you want, but I'm not going to review those. And as you're going to see, with any time I have a Part 1 lecture, I always cite the Pearson book that I'm following along with. Like I've said, most of the images I take are going to come from the Fundamentals of Anatomy and Physiology from Martini, Nath, and Bartholomew, as you can see right down there. Alright, so we're going to follow right along, and this is kind of now back on track with the book, working our way down the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and we'll just keep moving along from there. Alright, so let's start off with how endocrine control works, or how hormonal control really is regulated throughout. And so it's going to occur via endocrine reflexes, and reflexes were minorly introduced. Again, I kind of follow along if you did Anatomy 1 and Anatomy 2, and so if you followed Anatomy 1, usually you have the nervous system, and you should have heard about reflexes, and reflexes were automated responses. Well, when it comes to the endocrine system, and pretty much any system we move forward where we have unconscious control, we're going to be dealing with that system-specific reflex. So when we get to the respiratory system, we're going to be dealing with respiratory reflexes. When we get to the digestive system, digestive reflexes. So endocrine control is done by endocrine reflexes, which means we have to have endocrine sensory units that eventually trigger a hormonal response. So we have to sense. We are now looking over some of the major processing centers right now, because of course the hypothalamus is part of the brain, so one of the major processing centers, and then of course the effector is what hormones being released, and then we target whatever cells. Alright, so the 3 types of stimuli that are going to trigger a reflex to begin, right? Because we have to sense. So we're talking the receptor side of things, receptors in our bloodstream, receptors in our interstitial fluids, receptors in basically any fluid that we have. We're likely to have receptors detecting what those fluids are and what's in there. And so we can have something called humoral stimuli, and literally this is changes in extracellular fluid. In extracellular fluid, if you want to kind of define this, this is the fluid that sits outside of cells, so kind of sitting outside and bathing tissues, as well as the tissues found within the blood vessels, or basically blood plasma. Those are extracellular fluids. So any changes to those fluids can trigger the release of a hormone. It can trigger a hormonal response or an endocrine response to release hormones. Then we can have hormonal stimuli, and this is what we're going to focus on heavily today because we're dealing with the master endocrine gland. And hormonal stimuli is one hormone will stimulate the release, or it can be the inhibition. We're not going to focus on kind of blocking hormone secretion, but basically this is saying when one hormone binds to an organ, it can stimulate that organ to release another specific hormone. So notice hormone stimulates the release of another specific hormone when it reaches its target tissue or target organ. Alright, so that's hormonal stimuli, and we're going to see this, like I said, a lot. So if this doesn't make sense, we're going to be seeing it today. Basically, the hypothalamus, we're going to see releases a lot of regulatory hormones, and notice it controls the release of hormones from here. We're going to see that a little bit. We can also have neural stimuli. So neural stimuli can actually cause like sympathetic stimulation can actually cause the release of hormones, specifically at something called a neuroglandular junction. And down here we can see a neuroglandular junction. So basically, neural stimuli causes neurotransmitters to release neurotransmitters in there, and those neurotransmitters will cause the release of epinephrine, norepinephrine. Hence, when we have sympathetic stimulation, right, that's when our heart rate goes up, breathing rate goes up. That's all caused by adrenaline, which is released by the adrenal medulla. And the reason that gets in our bloodstream so fast is we have neural stimuli. We're not relying on the blood to cause the release of that, right? All right, but keep in mind, most secretion is always going to be negative feedback. Not all secretion, but most. So basically, any hormone that gets released will usually also go back and target its own self. So kind of like an autocrine communication, where it'll slow down how much of that hormone is going to be released in the future. So basically, pressing the brakes, right? That's what negative feedback is. Hormone release is greatest for the initial response. Like, just think about consuming a meal and having insulin being released, right? When we consume a meal and we start that digestion, insulin is going to be secreted at the highest, and then, an hour after we have eaten, we wouldn't expect insulin to be secreted in as high as concentration because we've been absorbing those nutrients. Certainly, blood glucose levels are on the rise, but they were on the highest rise at the kind of initial completion of the meal. So that's what negative feedback is. Greatest initial response, and then, like I said, as digestion commences and breaks down, we're going to slowly decline the amount of insulin that gets secreted. All right, so the main point from this slide, again, MP, that's what that stands for, is that these are the three different types of stimuli that are going to cause the release or inhibition of hormone release, but really we're focused on the release side. Like I said, rarely am I going to focus on inhibition related to hormone secretions in this lecture. All right, but let's continue on with the hypothalamus. And so, as I said, the hypothalamus, we should think of the hypothalamus as the president because it's going to produce a wide range of hormones that regulate areas. And so first, we're going to just hit out hypothalamus. Master endocrine gland targets 3 organs via 3 ways. And kind of interesting that we just brought up the 3 ways that hormones get released. All right, but let's start off with how the hypothalamus targets the anterior pituitary gland. So notice the pituitary gland, even though it's one gland, it gets broken up into 2 parts because it actually has 2 types of tissues. The tissues are very diverse. This is primarily like neural tissue into sort of blood vessels, and then this is definitely epithelial glandular-like tissue here. All right, so the anterior pituitary is being regulated by the hypothalamus, and it's regulated by something called regulating hormones. And these regulating hormones can either be releasing hormones or inhibiting. And just to kind of describe those, you can see that below here, the 2 changes in colors. Releasing hormones are going to be those that stimulate the production and secretion of hormones made by the anterior pituitary. So literally stimulating these to produce a hormone and then start secreting it. So that's like the first level of communication. Here, this is saying, hey, something needs to be done. It communicates it. Then the anterior pituitary will now release a hormone. So really, these regulating hormones are a perfect example of when we were talking hormonal stimuli. That's exactly what regulating hormones are, especially the releasing hormones. These are specifically your hormonal stimuli. All right, inhibiting hormones, on the other hand, these would reduce production and secretion. And like I said, I'll mention a couple of them, but they're not going to be the prime focus on any lecture here. And so this is going to bring us to the posterior pituitary gland, which is really interesting. So this is the posterior side of the pituitary gland. And well, if you notice, we have neurons. So these are the cell bodies within the hypothalamus. And notice their axons extend into the posterior pituitary. So what this means is the hypothalamus actually produces antidiuretic hormone and actually produces oxytocin, but those the actual hormones get stored in the axon terminals of the posterior pituitary. So here, you need to know the posterior pituitary is the site of secretion for ADH and oxytocin, but you have to be crystal clear that you understand that it is not production. I am very strict on this. I would imagine other instructors would be really strict on it. So overall, you're going to learn that the pituitary glands secrete 9 hormones, but 7 are produced by the anterior pituitary, and 2 of those pituitary hormones are actually produced by the hypothalamus, and those 2 are located right there. And then finally, the hypothalamus also controls the adrenal medulla. It does so via sympathetic nerves. So sympathetic nerves, when we have sympathetic stimulation that occurs, those nerves end up causing neurotransmitter secretion, and that's going to stimulate the hormones made by the adrenal medulla. Do you know which ones those are? And hopefully you're able to just nail those out and know that are they water soluble, lipid soluble, and kind of know what their functions are. If you remember, I talked about these. I'm going to give you the answer right here. That would have been epinephrine and norepinephrine. Their functions are in emergency metabolic activity, and those are catecholamines, which means they are tyrosine derivative and they are water soluble. So those would be all of the details you should be able to pinpoint or really think out when you're listing off hormones. Get in that habit of being able to kind of describe that the way I just did. All right, but this brings us to the hormones of the hypothalamus here. Okay, and so again, we're just looking at the hormones. This is overlapping. This is a slightly different figure. The previous figure was 18.5, I believe, and this is 18.6. But the hormones of the hypothalamus to know, we're going to focus on releasing hormones. Yes, there are inhibiting hormones, but we're going to focus on the releasing hormones. And to be clear, the color code on this slide is unique. Whenever I do it unique, I'll tell you, but in most cases, like I said, it's red to red. But in this case, the hormones are going to be in red. So releasing hormones is a hormone of the hypothalamus. Green is going to be the target. So releasing hormones target the anterior pituitary. And what do those hormones do? They increase the production and release of the hormones of the anterior pituitary. We are going to get specific with 3 releasing hormones in just a little bit. We'll talk about the 3 specific ones you need to know. Now, the next set of hormones of the hypothalamus are the antidiuretic hormones. All right, so ADH, antidiuretic. You need to know that this targets the kidneys. That's its location. That's where it's going to go. And its function is to increase water retention or water reabsorption, which means its goal is to increase blood pressure when blood pressure is low. So the endocrine the endocrine reflex, when we're talking about the receptor side, basically when the body senses that blood pressure is low or that there's a high salt concentration in the blood, that's when antidiuretic hormone would be secreted. But most cases when I test on it on low blood pressure, because the goal is to conserve water to keep blood pressure constant. So by not allowing urine formation, we keep that water in our body, and that keeps blood volume higher. And by having higher blood volume, it's going to help increase blood pressure. So that's what ADH does, is it maintains blood pressure when blood pressure is starting to decrease, or we say it increases water reabsorption or retention, which helps increase blood pressure. So just think increase of blood pressure when blood pressure is low. That's ADH. All right, and then we get to oxytocin. Oxytocin is quite unique. We're going to focus primarily on the more anatomy side and less on the psychological side. But oxytocin is definitely a feel-good sort of hormone. It's associated with touch. So like if you shake hands, give hugs, there's oxytocin release. So it's a feel-good hormone for sure. Our focus on this is going to be how it helps with various processes. So even though certainly feeling good is an important process, but we're going to focus on oxytocin targeting the uterus, and it does so during contractions and during childbirth. So oxytocin hits the uterus causes a contraction goes back to the hypothalamus and causes more oxytocin release in a rare positive feedback loop. So both of these are positive feedback loops here. But you also need to know oxytocin targets the breasts, and it does so to cause them to release milk. And this one's pretty important that you know it targets the breast to release milk. We're going to get to a pituitary hormone called prolactin, and prolactin causes the production of milk, which I always test on, production of milk versus milk release. So make sure you know those 2 hormones. And overall, both of these, oxytocin, their impacts are considered a positive feedback loop. So suckling on the breast from an infant will cause milk release, and more milk release causes more release of oxytocin. So just kind of this positive feedback loop here. All right, so definitely know these. ADH is one of the most important hormones. You're going to see this throughout the entire semester. I bring up ADH all the time. You need to know it helps with blood pressure. We're going to be moving on to cardiovascular system, which means we're going to be talking about blood pressure, and ADH is going to be getting brought up. Anytime I mention blood pressure, just think that's going to be an important hormone to completely memorize and know moving forward. All right, but as far as the releasing hormones to know, and so these are hormones that target the anterior pituitary that result in the production and release of a specific hormone. And so these are the 3 to know. So thyrotropin releasing hormone, or TRH. Notice this stimulates the production and release of thyroid stimulating hormone. These hormones right here in this table are the pituitary gland hormones. And here's your thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH. Notice hypothalamic regulating hormone. We're going to just focus on the releasing side. So notice thyrotropin releasing hormone, as in the name suggests, it's a releasing hormone. But notice stimulates the production and release of TSH. As the name thyroid stimulating hormone suggests, it's going to stimulate the thyroid gland. So notice we have one hormone stimulating the release of another hormone, and that hormone is going to move on to stimulate the release of thyroid hormone. So that's what I mean. Our body does a lot of these cascades or chemical cascades where basically we have a lot of systemic control by having more steps involved. The other good releasing hormone to know would have been your CRH, which you can see right here, corticotropin releasing hormone. All right, and it's fine abbreviating it. Usually on an exam, I write it out as corticotropin releasing hormone and then have the abbreviation next to it. Now, in that case, you need to know that that stimulates the release specifically of ACTH or adrenocorticotropic hormone right here. Again, these are all targeting the anterior pituitary. And then finally, the final releasing hormone, and again, if it's a releasing hormone, it's targeting the anterior pituitary always. The final one to know is GnRH, or gonadotropic releasing hormone right there. And notice the word tropin is in all these. Tropic hormones are hormones that stimulate the release of other hormones. All right, so thyroid stimulating hormone is technically a tropic hormone because it's going to stimulate the release of thyroid hormone. All right, but adrenocorticotropic, it's going to stimulate the release of cortisol and cortisone. We'll be getting to that in a little bit later here. All right, but for now, this kind of covers the big picture things. I know it doesn't seem like we've gotten through a great deal of content, but this is how I want most of my lectures to go. I think this was a great introduction to the hypothalamus. We really covered the key parts. The hypothalamus is quite complex because students often overlook the fact that they're producing releasing hormones. The ADH and oxytocin are pretty straightforward, and the fact that it stimulates the adrenal medulla usually is not too challenging. It's not something that like really stands out with a lot of testing material on there, but certainly knowing those releasing hormones and having a good understanding of what the hypothalamus does is important. Now, obviously, we're going to be moving on to the pituitary gland next, so you do need to make sense of this. I don't know if it's better for you to move on to part 2 of the lecture, certainly get a glimpse of what the actual pituitary gland does. But when you're in there, just start to realize you need to start working through and identifying, are the hormones lipid soluble or water soluble? Now, I wasn't so great during this, but all the hormones that we just mentioned, those are all peptide based hormones. None of those hormones mentioned were related to being a steroid hormone. So far, the only hormones we've really talked about specifically, getting into their details, is in fact peptide hormones. That was insulin so far, ADH, oxytocin, TRH, CRH, and GnRH. All right, but I'll remind you of those as we keep moving along here. Certainly I got a lot to review when we go over into the next part. So look out for that lecture. Thank you for listening. I hope you are starting to grasp how my lecture style goes and the sort of ways I record lectures. Take care, everyone, and I'll see you at Lecture 2, Part 2, which will be the pituitary gland. And then you'll see Part 3 goes into more of the histology side. So take care, everyone. We'll see you back at Lecture 2, Part 2.